is the governance and everyday life of Islam in Europe. For the next 3 hours, we will discuss about the governance of Islam and everyday life of Islam in Europe. Before we proceed, please allow me first to read today's agenda. The first agenda is the opening session. The next is the seminar led by our moderator, and the last is closing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now in the opening session. We would like to ask everyone to please rise for the singing of the Indonesian National Anthem, Indonesia Raya, and the hymn of Universitas Airlangga. Thank you. Everyone may take your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to invite the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities Universitas Airlangga, Professor Dr. Purnawan Basundoro, to deliver the opening remarks. Professor Purnawan, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The Excellency Professor Til Schoner from Vrije University Netherlands. I call you Pak Til from Netherlands or Belanda. The Excellencies, all partners from universities and institutions in Surabaya, Universitas Islam Negeri Sunan Ampel Surabaya, Universitas Muhammadiyah Sidoarjo, Universitas Muhammadiyah Surabaya, Universitas Islam Negeri Maulana Malik Ibrahim Malang, Sekolah Tinggi Agama Islam Al-Fitrah Surabaya, pengurus wilayah Nahdlatul Ulama Jawa Timur, and pengurus wilayah Muhammadiyah Jawa Timur. The Excellencies, our Vice Deans, Head of Study Program and Lecturer of Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Airlangga, and all participants. First of all, please allow to express my gratitude for your enthusiasm and participation in today's seminar, the governance and everyday life of Islam in Europe. The first 2 decades of the 21st century have presented to us order of community life, which is different from the previous periods. The massive development of information technology, which then triggered the birth of the 4th Industrial Revolution, also influenced this condition. As a short user as well as the target of this development, humans and society also experience paradigm shift and change in many ways, including culture. Culture in this context is no longer understood as practice within the traditional scope, but as a whole community activity that is part of everyday life and has become a habit. COVID-19 pandemic that has happened for 2 years has been part of today's culture. This is considering that the pandemic has caused a shift in a number of line of people lives, which in the end construct new practice in culture. One of which is Islamic culture. The position of Islam is part of today's global order in relation to the West, often spark a number of disruptions that lead to a number of questions about regulation, border, and identity. And this reality seems to be distant for some academics and Indonesian society, yet it is in fact a more and now mostly influential. Therefore, it will be interesting to review this topic from another perspective, which is also in direct contact with the practice of Islamic culture in Europe. I would like to say thank you to Pak Til or Professor Dr. Til Schoener from Vrije University, Amsterdam, for sharing his insight and experiences about Islam in Europe. To Ibu Dewi, where's Ibu Dewi? Ibu Dewi Meresarwati, who have opened the opportunity for us to meet Professor Til from Amsterdam, to Ibu Nurbulan, who has been willing to moderate, to leaders of university, head of academic program, and leader of University of Islamic Institution, who have accepted our invitation in this seminar, and English Language Department, and Committee College, who have made this seminar possible, students and all audience. I expect that this seminar will lead us to further partnership and collaboration in academic researches and academic activities in the future. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the seminar. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Purnawan, for the opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, now we have come to our main agenda, the seminar session. This session will be led by our moderator, Ibu Nurbulan, PhD. Without further ado, I will hand over the floor to Ibu Bulan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ibu Nurbulan, PhD.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. I think I can invite Professor Til to come here, maybe.
Yeah.
I will introduce you later.
I'm sorry, my English not good.
Okay. So, thank you very much for the invitation. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, selamat pagi, and hello to all of the audiences, honorable and invited guests, especially those coming from outside Airlangga University. I think it is such an honor for us to have you here in this seminar. And welcome to UNER, welcome to One Day National Seminar held by Faculty of Humanities and organized by the Department of English Language and Literature. The topic about Islam governance and everyday Islam in Europe, I think is such an interesting topic for us, yeah, because I think we know that Islam has been it's an interesting topic to discuss about Islam in relation to Western modernity, especially after the 9/11 event. Yeah, we know that there has been a heightened maybe opposition between Islam and Western modernity, and I think it also I think we know that the project on the war on terror, I think, is also, I think, has associated Islam with radicalism and terror. But now we are going to have insights, maybe more comprehensive insights from a European scholar, yeah, about the field. And our special guest here is Professor Thail Sunya, and he is now currently an emeritus Professor of Anthropology of Religion and Chair of Islam in European Societies at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And he is also the chairman of the board of the Netherlands Inter-University School for Islamic Studies. He has published numerous books and articles in the field, and I don't think I have to state them one by one, yeah, but I think I can mention one of the most current publication by Professor Thail, and it is an article entitled Authoritative Landscapes, the Making of Islamic Authority Among Muslims in Europe. And currently, Professor Thail is also in the process of writing a book, yeah, called The Anthropology of Islamic Authority. So I think, as Mbak Dahlia has already mentioned, our seminar today will be divided into two sessions. The first is about the governance of Islam in Europe, and it will take 1 hour, and it will be followed by 10 minutes question and answer. So in the first session, Professor Thail will be primarily discussing about the role of state, yeah, in governing and regulating Islamic societies in Europe. So I think without further ado, let's start the first session. Professor Thail, the floor is yours.
Can I stand?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Otherwise, I have to constantly look at this
Yeah.
direction.
Or
while
you
it's-
need assistance?
Shall I do it? Can I do it myself? Or? Yeah, it's make that easier. Shall I? Is it okay that I take this off?
There it is. Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind introduction. Thank you, Dean, for the nice words. And I'm very honored to be here. And I know your university for quite some time because Dewi Merazawati is one of my PhDs. So we had a long introduction, and finally I'm here at this university. I'm not. Let's start immediately, but because I have a lot of things to say, and I will bombard you with information. I'm sorry. That's. I will start with a very short introduction to give you some context about facts and figures and numbers, and then I go to the first topic, which is governance. So let me see if I have to go that way. Yes. So you saw that already. Well, there is one additional thing too, actually. I'm the chief editor of the Journal of Muslims in Europe. It's a journal by Brill in Leiden. Some of you are familiar with this publisher. And I'm currently, that's one of the reasons why I'm in Indonesia. I'm involved in a project called Mediating Islam in the Digital Age. And we have 15 researchers from all over the world. And together we, well, the main topic of the research is to see what the influence is of digitization, of digital technology on Islam, not only on the study of Islam, but also on Islamic practices. I mean, think of khutbahs on YouTube, think of, all kind of chat groups, etc., these kind of things. Okay. Can I point to the, okay. So, just as I said, a brief context. The image of Islam in Europe, we have, there was a question asked, how many Muslims are there in Europe? It's very embarrassing, because I don't know. But there is an estimate of kind of 40 million, including people in Russia, in the western part of Russia. But, you know, what do numbers say? Let's talk about the image. The image, the dominant image of Islam in Europe is that Muslim presence is new and unprecedented, and it has to do with the migration after the Second World War to European countries from countries like Morocco and Turkey mainly, but also other countries. So the idea was that was the first time we had to do with Muslims in Europe, which is very strange. I mean, if you take the UK and France, for example, they have millions of Muslims from former colonies, North Africa, the Indian subcontinent, but also the Netherlands. And as you know, the Netherlands ruled over this country for many, many centuries, and it was, and still is, the most populous country of the world with Muslims. And if the Netherlands then say, well, it's new and unprecedented, it's weird to say the least. But we have to deal with that. So the result of post-war labor migration, I continue quickly. So there are three things that are important if you look at this image. One is the idea that Europe is that Islam is a non-European religion, or that Europe is not Islamic but Christian, for example. The assumed assumed numbers of Muslims in Europe, that it is much higher than the actual numbers. That's the image. And third one is, and it was already mentioned, 9/11 and all, the threat. You know, Muslims are mainly a challenge and a threat to security, to societies, etc., etc. And this comes in all kind of forms, and I'm not going to deal with that today, but it's important to mention. Well, here you see a map of the Ottoman Empire in the heyday, so that's kind of 17th century, and you can immediately see that the larger part of this Ottoman Empire, and especially if you look at the number of inhabitants, was in Europe. So already for ages, Islam was present in Europe. Now, if we look at the numbers, Muslims constitute a small minority of the European population, but these numbers are exaggerated. It has to do with this image. Here you see some figures. For example, France, it says 7.5%, Spain 2.1%, the Netherlands 6%, but then if you go to the east, it's much lower. The average is something like 4%, so it's absolutely a tiny minority. Even if all these Muslims have something bad in mind, then it's still absolutely neglectable. But the point is, it's not so much the numbers themselves, but the idea behind that. Here you see the European Union, which is only a part of Europe. Only 3% is Muslim, the rest is non-Muslim. But the image is, what you can see below, is that streets in European cities are crowded with Muslims. They cannot even, there are so many that they have to pray in the street, etc. This is a very ordinary picture in Paris, in a mosque on Friday afternoon. And there was construction going on in that neighborhood. That was the reason why they were sitting out, they were praying outside. But the idea is, you know, this is our future. So, deteriorating political climate, and I'm really sorry to say that, and it worries me a lot. The growing Islamophobia, you know, the ideas about the threat of Islam. It triggers moral panic. Events such as 9/11, the attacks in Paris. Just on the news was that one of the survivors of these terrorist attacks has now a lifelong sentence. So Islam becomes the shorthand for everything that you know, that is bad and that unspecific fears indeed an anti-Islam rhetoric. But, and this is, and then I think this is the last slide of this brief introduction. I think these four red bullets are very important to take into consideration. It's also the basis for the rest of my talk. Sorry. Because my idea is, I mean, in a while I'm going to speak, again I have all kind of examples on Europe, but my overall argument is that there is more similarities and parallels between a country like Indonesia, despite all the huge differences with Europe, but there are striking similarities in the sense that, you know, Islam is still considered, I think it's the same here in Indonesia, but also in Europe, something from the Middle East. Now that may be true to a large extent. I mean, many important places, not all, of Islam are in the Middle East, the Gulf region, North Africa. But there is a world outside the Middle East. And one part of this world is here in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, and the other one is Europe. Because, as I said, you know, for many people, there are many indigenous Muslims in Europe as well. I didn't deal with them here, but in countries like Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, western parts of Russia, there's a majority of Muslims, and they are indigenous. They are not migrants. They are there already for, I don't know how long. But these migrants, I mean, there are no migrants anymore. The majority of Muslims in the western part of Europe, in the Netherlands, for example, is born and raised in the Netherlands. They are European Muslims. So what you see emerging in Europe is comparable to what you see emerging here. Many Muslims here also have this awareness of, you know, we are not just a kind of a side issue or an effect of the Middle East. Something is emerging here on its own. It's a kind of an almost autonomous development, and that's what you see in Europe. So I think, that's my main argument, I think that this allows for a very interesting kind of exploration of, you know, what happens then, all kind of, and that's what I'm going to do in my lectures. So, migration is a thing of the past. I already said it. The other thing, very important, upward social mobility. For a long time in Europe, Muslims in Europe were, you know, there was an economic and a cultural dividing line. So Muslims were in the lowest ranks of society. They did low-paid jobs, etc., cleaning. Today you find Muslims everywhere, and for me that's, I mean, my university, for example, I have, in all classes I did, I'm now retired, I don't give regular teaching anymore, but in all my classes there are Muslims, and I think that's a very good development. And I spoke to somebody a couple of months ago, and she said, well, she did a course at the university for elderly people, and she said, well, interesting, but I see so many women with a hijab. And I thought, what's the point? I think that's a very good indication that Muslim women go to universities. Yeah. So, and that's what I call the fear of proximity. What you see currently, but I think it's temporal, that the more you find Muslims everywhere in society, the more people start feeling, you know, uneasy, and they translate this, and the fact that Muslims, you know, reach higher levels of education, etc. They translate that into Islamization. You know, Muslims are taking over. And that's very bad. I mean, but it's something. This is just a picture, everyday picture in a street somewhere in Europe. It's very bad, but I think I end there. Oh, yeah, local activism, Muslims in politics. Here on the top, people. There is a growing poverty in Europe due to the war in Ukraine. So prices are rising. So you see more people. They need, care. And here you see a group of Muslim women and other women who volunteer, that kind of thing. Young leaders. All these people are born and raised in Europe. And again here, climate action, all kinds of activities in which Muslims are involved. I think this is the last one. So, in all, what I want to say is it takes time. At the moment, people, non-Muslims, many, not all of them, feel a kind of uneasiness when they see Muslims everywhere, in universities, in all kinds of professions, etc. In the long run, I think that will change, and especially these young Muslims are those who will do that, not me. I'm a white, retired professor, non-Muslim. It's their job, and they will do it. So then I'm pretty optimistic. I think I leave it for now, and please can you go to the next governance of Islam PowerPoint, please. Can I just take my water?
You also.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, governance of Islam. There we go. So what is governance? What do I mean by governance? My first statement here is governance is certainly not a neutral, manageable technique to control and process. That's often the idea that states are neutral and they apply all kinds of techniques and they do that blindfolded, neutral. But governance is always envisioned by goals and imagined orders. That means that there's always a program behind that. And what I mean, I come to that in a while. So what is governance? It's the implementation of these goals and these imagined orders. Now, sometimes we tend to think of imagined orders as this, the Utopia, the famous book by Thomas More, written 16th century, 16th century. But imagination is crucial, but an often forgotten element in government. But we only tend to think of these kind of dreams, or this, the future city. My son has a little company where he does these kind of things, making cities green, more green against heat stress, that kind of things. But then you end up in these kind of beautiful imaginations. The point is that governance and order, I don't know whether you know this sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, who wrote a lot about his whole family was murdered by the Nazis in the Second World War, and his whole life was dedicated to this idea of how modernity produces what he called redundancy, waste. It's something that that modernity doesn't need, so you exclude all kind of things. So for Zygmunt Bauman, modernity and governance in this respect always created people who were the losers, who were excluded. This is also a well-known dream of a you know, a future, I would like to include that in this idea of governance. If you know the speech in 2015, Baghdadi, who pronounced the Islamic State, it was full of these kind of ideas. He invited people to come there, etc. So there is no big difference between this and, you know, any European state governing. The principle is the same. Or think of this, communist society, ideas about how good it is and how or this one, again a very infamous example, the Lebensraum, as the Nazis call that. The Germans need more space to live, so they had to extend their territory. It's based on a dream, or it's based on an imagination, an idea of a better world. And there's nothing wrong with that in itself. It, of course, is wrong when you, as Zygmunt Bauman said, when you extinct people, in the case of the Nazis, especially the Jews, and you say, well, we don't need you for our dream. Something went wrong, I don't know. Yeah. So I want to mention here an interesting book, if you're interested in this topic. Maybe some of you know that, James Scott, Seeing Like a State. It's about big projects of states, you know, the implementation of agricultural huge programs, etc., etc. And he shows how these things can go terribly wrong. If you only look at, you know, at these things from a top-down helicopter view, and you do not look at how it works, how people, you know, live those designs, these big engineering projects. But it is a very interesting book to see this connection between dreams or imaginations. I remember, I give you one little anecdote. My father traveled a long time ago in the Soviet Union in Central Asia, and they were doing projects there to turn the direction of rivers. You know, and at this moment I heard that there are plans to, you know, to interfere in clouds, to make rain, etc., etc. The problem is, it sounds very good, and in this case of Central Asia, with the rivers, with the drought, etc., and desert, it sounds good, but it's also extremely dangerous. So this is what James Scott tried to argue. If you only look to things from top down, you don't see the facts on the ground, right? So the point is, and that's what there are big dreams, but in fact governance is not just about, you know, putting dreams into practice. It is simply effectuating political and social order and a bureaucratic process. This is a topic I'm currently working on, bureaucratization of Islam in Europe. Going to write an article on that. So that's the everyday normal things that you come across in this country, in any country. And religion is a very important dimension of state government programs, and it's a fruitful angle. When I put something in red, it means I find it important. So if you write down, this is the kind of keyword, but we can keep these PowerPoints here. They can stay here, of course. So it's a fruitful angle from which to assess forms of governance. And there are basically three modes of religious, or not religious governance, governance of religion. Maybe that's a better formulation. State power is legitimated through a religious discourse. That's one. Think of Iran. It's a typical example. and sometimes people tend to say, well, there are countries such as Saudi Arabia, the law is based on Sharia, which is true, but it's also not true. I mean, it's far more complicated. The relation between, you know, Islamic law and governance is much more complicated than just that. And so, but legitimation means at least that, you know, this is the stamp of good quality, so to speak. Or a particular religious authority is appropriated by the state. Well, that's a variation on that. Or, and that's something you will find also in this country, but also in Europe, is the neutral state, the so-called neutral state, as the organizer of religious diversity. So that's again another way of dealing with that. Here I have a few examples. Iran, the Velayat Faqih, Saudi Arabia, Sharia, Islamic State, the Caliphate, but also the Vatican, the Catholic capital, so to speak. But if you look at European states, Hungary calls itself a Christian state. Now what that means is not very clear, but at least you see it in all kind of policy. Yeah? So Christianity is prioritized over other religions. The same with Israel, Jewish nation state bill. That's a new bill recently installed when Netanyahu was still the prime minister. Or Nepal, Hindu state since 2015. And the US and many European countries, they have a debate about religious roots of the nation states. So for example, in the Netherlands, we have a discussion about the Judeo-Christian, not Islamic, just Judeo-Christian identity of the Dutch state. The point is, it is very interesting if you look at the Netherlands, that the Judeo part was only added after the Second World War. Before that, it was called Christian. And now we have a discussion in which all kinds of people, Islamophobic people, are hotly against that, where they say, well, if there is Judeo-Christian, why not Islamic? You know, I mean, maybe you could argue, not a big deal, but it's an interesting discussion, this kind of identity of a state. Good. Where am I time-wise? Just to...
Yeah, you still have about 20 minutes.
Okay. So, the role of the state, governance and power, new approaches. This is my approach to that. And I criticize the idea of the state as a neutral apparatus. I already said that. It's too simple to refer to the state as simply technical, you know. I can speak for hours in this topic because there is much to say about it. The idea, at least, and that's an important word, it's not read, but it's important, social engineering. The idea that states do engineering work, technical work. In the Netherlands, for example, we have a discussion about the integration of migrants as a technical thing. It's not technical only. It's also, behind that there is a certain idea about how they should integrate. And if you ignore that, then you miss something out. So my position here is that nation states are not, you know, the neutral apparatus of country, of a nation state. Nation states are cultural projects. They present themselves to stories. I mean, don't consider it an offense, but we just had the national anthem. There's also all kind of, I couldn't follow it, but you know, in a national anthem, there is typically this kind of idea of the nation, how the nation perceives itself. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. This is how it works. And again, if we ignore that part, we miss out a lot. And religion can be a crucial constituent component in such narratives about the nation. And that's what I just explained. But this is important to keep in mind. Nation states are cultural, they have agency, they are cultural agents, they have active ideas about how the nation should look like, what we mean by citizens, that kind of thing. Oh. Yeah. So what you see in the last decades, and that is in Europe, that indeed this idea of the state as a cultural agent has become more important. It had to do with the migration, etc. They stepped up their role as intervening in these kind of ideas, developing ideas about what is the ideal citizen. And recently, in Europe, one of my colleagues from the University of Amsterdam, a couple of years ago, wrote an article in which he used the term the culturalization of citizenship. And it was about the Netherlands. And what he says is, 20 years ago, citizenship was something of rights and duties. It was legal, it was purely legally formulated. But today you see that the imagined citizen is defined much more in cultural terms. And if you combine that with this, this kind of resentment against Muslims, you can easily come to the conclusion that to some people, Muslims are not the ideal citizens. And this is precisely the arena in which young Muslims are finding themselves currently. It's the idea that you take critically issue with this idea that the ideal citizen is a person like me, and white, male, etc. And that rest is irrelevant. So this is an important arena where all kinds of discussions take place. Who are citizens and what are they? Neutral state, I already said that. What you see here is a quote by unfortunately she passed away a couple of years ago, Saleh Mahmoud, who did very interesting research. If you are interested, I show the book in a moment, on the governance of religion in Egypt. She said the liberal states, and for example many European states call themselves liberal, they claim to maintain a separation between church and state. But the problem is, and that's very interesting insight, that if you say, well, we separate religion and state, then you cannot maintain the idea that the state is neutral, because if you want to separate that, you constantly have to interfere in all kinds of, you have to organize, you have to govern this religious diversity in such a way that there is no separation anymore. That's very interesting insight. Here she is, and the book I refer to is Religious Difference in a Secular Age. Now, what Mahmoud did was, don't misunderstand the word secular here, and I'm not going to discuss that here because it goes way too far. But her point is, and I think the last bullet is the most important, secular is not what is left when you take out religion. That's an often heard misunderstanding. Secular is also, and if you know the work of Talal Asad, he also said, secular is also, it's a project, it's a certain idea, a certain imagination on which governance is based. It's not just neutral, non-religious, it is actively intervening and making this happen, active intervention. Yeah. Okay. Now, another term, and I didn't coin the term, but when I did my inaugural speech in 2009, it was called the domestication of Islam in Europe. Domesticate. Some of my colleagues said, well, domesticate, I think of animals. I said, well, domestication, it is nationalized, making it, making it according to, and that's what I say here, nation state, domesticate religion, in order to fit in the national narrative. That's so if we just spoke about this culturalization of citizen here. What is the ideal citizen? If you formulate, if you have a narrative about that, then that's a form of domestication. You make it into something that fits the national narrative. That also means that all kind of transnational links, and well, Muslims tend to have them. Say, well, that's problematic. You need to cut off your connections to the outside world. Little nation states, and that was my argument then, have a specific program to domesticate. It differs from country to country, but they all have that. They all try to fit religion in that format. And that's what John Bowen also spoke about, his work on France, also in Indonesia, by the way, but that was a different topic. So domestication is a mode of governance, and it's intervening. And if you speak about, for example, 9/11, you will see that this domestication, this program to nationalize, went in a different direction, securitization and all that. See where I am for the time, wait a minute. Yeah, well, I skip a few, and again look at these words: containment, categorization, classification. One important element indeed is categorization. If you say, well, there are more religions in this country, you start to categorize what belongs to this category and what to the next one. And you also ask yourself the question, how religion can be adopted to state authority. I said that. So interventions, very important. No neutral state, they intervene actively. Now, if you look at Europe, and here are some examples, then very importantly, again, this is a quote from an article I wrote based on that inaugural lecture. It is about the integration of Islam in Europe, but in fact it's explicitly about the challenges to the nation state. And again, this is where an idea comes in. You say, you argue that the arrival of Muslims is a challenge. So you have to deal with that. You have to develop all kinds of things. And one, of course, after the events, for example, 9/11, but other, is that securitization, the idea that Islam is a threat to security, has grown bigger, unfortunately. And some of my colleagues are really focusing on this securitization, and there's a whole literature there. Now, if you look at, I give a few examples of European states. This is what you see. There is religious freedom. That's kind of constitutional right. Okay, that's fine. There is historically developed legislation with regard to religion, and that differs in different countries. There are individual rights, again, constitutional, but there is an implicit prioritization still of Christianity. And that's, if you consider Europe if you consider Europe a non-Islamic continent, then in fact you prioritize other religions, in this case mainly Christianity. And what you see, and that's part of this, the larger picture in Europe, is that there is what it's called exceptionalism. So you say, well, there is a general rule, but with regard to Islam or with regard to this, we do differently. That doesn't mean always negatively. I mean, it can be kind of positive intervention, but in many situations it's negative. It means that, for example, in the Netherlands we have a discussion about Islamic schools. I'm not going into that deeply, but the point is that it's a constitutional right to have your own school. But most fuss is made about Islamic schools, and then you have to formulate why. And they come up with all kind of reasons that have nothing to do with this constitutional freedom. That's how it works. I leave this for a moment. Let me show you just 4 countries. France, emphasis on secular citizenship. What is good for the Republic is good for Muslims. No recognition of religion in France. And lately an increase of Islam's exceptionalism. In Germany, it's called a nation of dissent. The idea is that there is a prioritization of Christianity, but in the long run, other religions can also be recognized. But that takes time. That's not something done quickly. In the United Kingdom, there is no constitution, as you probably know, so rights are based on historical embeddedness. That means that Christianity has the best position there. In the Netherlands, there's also no recognition of religion. The dean just asked me how many Muslims are there in the Netherlands. Formally speaking, I don't know, because in the statistics, religion is not mentioned. It's simply not there. It's descent. It's where you come from, etc., etc. Okay. So here you see a few pictures of the case of France. And this infamous politician, she fortunately didn't win the elections, the recent elections. And she said at some point, Marine Le Pen, l'Islam de France n'existe pas. The French Islam does not exist. And that's this kind of statement I referred to earlier. And this is very interesting. I just dwell for a moment on this picture. This is taken in the heydays of Islamic State. And it was the time, you probably remember that, where they had these horrible clips on YouTube where they beheaded people, And there was a demonstration in France. No, let me put it like that. There was a call on Muslims in France and in other countries to demonstrate against that. And then the French state was kind of accused by, it was Saudi Arabia and other countries, they tried to incorporate Muslims. And they said, well, you are not part of Europe, etc. You see what happens, etc., etc. And these 2 women, they were demonstrating. What they have on their hijab is the French flag. This was a statement, and they said, we are French Muslims. Do not interfere. That's what they said to Saudi Arabia and other countries. That this is our battle here in this country. We belong to this country, and we are Muslims in this country. I find this really, really interesting example of what's going on in Europe. Well, Britain is a nation of communities, as I said. I did research in the UK years ago, St. Patrick's Day, and there's other things. So in Britain, you celebrate your background, your ethnicity, etc., etc. So that's an opportunity for Muslims also to do that, and it happens. Well, this is the census. As you can see, it's a majority Christian, but I already said that. But this is also what you see in Britain. The mayor of London is of Pakistani background. That was, in the UK, that was much earlier, or here the mayor of Bradford also. That was much earlier than in other countries in Europe. For example, and then immediately you see the kind of reaction. There was a member of the House of Lords. She was a Hindustani background, and she was allegedly corrupt, or it was not Hindustani, it was a Muslim. She was allegedly corrupt. So there's always reaction to that. But this is the situation in Britain. What you see in Germany, that again, there is a very strong focus on becoming German, having a German passport, which is extremely difficult. And once you have that, it's a kind of a victory, etc. So you often come across people who are very proud of here having a German passport. This is where we find most Muslims in the country, so more in the west than in the east. And the Netherlands is what I just called an integration country. You become Dutch by going to courses. Maybe you also attended that kind of courses. Inburgering for them. Inburgering is integration. So if you do well and you pass this exam, I failed, by the way. I did that exam as well. Then I sometimes need to laugh at it. This is also interesting. The man you see on the right hand side, he's the mayor of Rotterdam. It's one of the big cities in the Netherlands. Not big compared to Indonesian cities, but for us it's big. He is from Moroccan descent. And he tends to, very interesting, he tends to provoke. He is very well aware that some people rather see him go. But he's really very good in, keeping this balance. I really admire him. Historical cases of Dutch, and that's where I end. Hopefully I'm not...
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. How good am I? I thought I was... to end up, I give you a few examples, yes, of, this domestication. During the Ottoman Empire, the city of Jerusalem was a typical example of how the Ottomans categorized religion and how they did that. They had so-called millet system, which is a kind of religious community system. And when you go to the old city of Jerusalem, you still find the traces of that. And the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter. Here again, pictures of Jerusalem with the Aqsa Mosque. Or think of Turkey, interesting case also. This was a Byzantine church, built I think 400 or 500 what is it, AD, after Christ. It was a church, and then when the Ottomans conquered Istanbul or Constantinople, they turned this church into a mosque, and that's what you see below. You see these signs, but the mosque is not, the church is not in the direction of Mecca. It's, so the mihrab is somewhere in a strange angle. Anyway, when the Republic in 1923 was established, they turned it into a museum, and now they turn it back into a mosque. So you see that such a building is a kind of a symbol of how you consider religions and how you, and the current government in Turkey is well, is determined to to bring back, so to speak, Islam more than it had been before. Or think of the city of Beirut in Lebanon, also a divided city, and also based on the old Ottoman categorization, divisions, and the war in the 70s and the 80s was, you know, through these dividing lines. Or Bosnia, a recent example. It's Ottoman legacy, but it's also something that works, continues to work until this day. Belfast, I skipped that. The last thing, two pictures here, or three actually, horrible pictures. On the right top side you see it's the Jewish quarter. This is in the Netherlands, so there were areas where Jews had to live and they couldn't go outside, etc. It was the beginning of the Holocaust. It was the beginning of the mass murder of Jews, and it started with separating cities and places. Or think of, this is not religious, the white area, which is in South Africa during the apartheid. Also, you design places for specific groups, and this is a way to govern. Now here's an example on the left-hand side, in the city of The Hague, the capital of the Netherlands, where there is a neighborhood called the Schilderswijk, where there is a majority of Muslims. And the image is, and it's called Vergeten Driehoek, that's the forgotten triangle, also known as the Sharia triangle. Absolutely nonsense. There was a journalist who coined that, and then it became an enormous discussion about, you know, about whether or not this area was actually governed by Salafis, or that kind of nonsense. So then you see a reaction, and you see that the municipality of The Hague took measures. You know, so again, this is an example of governance in the spatial aspect of governance. I think I stop here. I have a lot more to say, but I leave that. Yeah. So my idea of a kind of question, but of course it's to you to ask question, is that there are grounds, if you take this idea of governance, to compare cases, Indonesia, Europe, what have you. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that it's a bit too much.
Thank you, Prof. Till. I think it's such an interesting lecture. I took a lot of notes, so many insights from the lecture. Okay, so I think for the first...
Can I sit there?
Yeah, sure, please. So for the first session, I think we have only 10 minutes question and answer session. So maybe I can give chance to two participants, maybe. Pak Sarkari.
Terima kasih Ibu Gunan. Thank you for your lecture, interesting lecture, Pak Tim, Professor Tim. By the way, your dress is very nice. Your batik is very nice.
Thank you.
I think there are two very important issues in your presentation. The first one is integration country and labor migration. By the way, I went to Holland for twice, and according to my brief observation in Holland for 3 months, very brief, Muslim, according to my opinion, my belief, migrants from Morocco more assimilated than from Turkey. This is my feeling.
It's interesting.
Yeah. If my opinion is true, maybe there is a related between the Ottoman Kingdom. Maybe some years ago, Erdogan from Turkey said in his speech, if you want to another country, you have to the best in that country. You must have the best car. You have to mass education, according to Erdogan. So I just want to know your opinion for my philanthropic thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I respond immediately or?
I think we can collect one more question.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question maybe from lady. Is there any lady to ask a question? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. So, Professor, I just want to ask a simple question actually. I wonder whether, is there any particular reasons behind the high population of Muslims in Germany and France? Yeah, do life of Muslims become easier there or something like that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, the integration, yeah, but I don't want to, to start a discussion, but it depends, of course, on what you mean by integration, because as there is one concept in the Netherlands that's completely, vague, etc., then it's integration. For example, many Muslims today say, what are you talking about? We were born here. And many of them, I speak Turkish, and I met many young Muslims with a Turkish background, their parents or grandparents, and I speak better Turkish than they do, for example. So, and they then excuse themselves for that. So, what is integration? We did a good education here, we speak the language. What do you want? What do you mean? Well, actually, and that's the point, what they mean is, if you put off your hijab, then you are integrated, and that's, of course, that's another thing. Anyway, this is in general. But your question, the difference, well, there is some, it's an interesting discussion going on in the Netherlands about the difference between Turks and Moroccans, and one explanation, I think there is some truth in it, but there's more, is that right from the start, in the late 60s and early 70s, Turkish migrants were always better organized. So very early on, you had all kinds of organizations that took care for the migrants. So not so much Muslims, but migrants. They were also the first to establish mosques, which were makeshift. You probably saw them in a garage or in an ordinary house or whatever. So this is the reason why in the beginning, that's the explanation, that they were better organized. So they went ahead very quickly. But then, so the argument goes, this well organized with links to Turkey, etc., became a kind of a barrier to being member of society. And this was not the case with Moroccans. Now, some people say, because of Turks are so well organized still, you won't find, and there's some truth in that, you won't find that many radical Muslims, jihadis, etc., among Turks, and more among Moroccans, because there is this kind of effect of the organization. If you raise, then you're immediately pulled back into that kind of argument. The flip side is indeed that among Moroccans, you see many more people who, you know, well known. For example, the mayor of Rotterdam is Moroccan. I don't know about Turkish mayors in the Netherlands, you know. So you see that too. So there is some truth in that, but at the same time, I think we have to be careful in putting too much emphasis on it. But I think there is it's an important part of the explanation. I hope that answers your question. As to the other question about the number of Muslims in Germany and France, relatively speaking, I mean, what is 8%? Nothing. You know, it's still a tiny minority. Well, the point is simply this has to do with migration, and it has to do with the fact that Germany had very early on. They had, especially in Turkey and in what was then called Yugoslavia in southeastern Europe, they had these contracts with companies, etc., to send people. And Germany was very successful in that. So they attracted very early on many people with a Muslim background from Turkey and from that part of Europe. In the case of France, it has to do with, and that's what you see in the UK as well, because there also numbers are relatively high, is because the majority of Muslims in France and in the UK come from former colonies. So it was relatively easy, you know, to come to first the motherland, so to speak, and later on the former colonial power. So it was easier. So there was much less labor migration as in the case of Germany or in the Netherlands, and there was much more people coming from these former colonies. It has an interesting side effect, by the way. I mentioned that yesterday in another lecture, that there is this saying among Surinamese people in the Netherlands, former colony of the Netherlands. They say, "We are here because you were there." I still find that brilliant, you know. So you just remind the former colonizer, it's not our fault. You first were in our country, you know. So that's different in the Netherlands, for example, because the number of people from former colonies, from Indonesia and from Suriname, are relatively low. In the case of Indonesia, because it's far away, and it's also Suriname. It's, you know, the distances, whereas Turks and Moroccans, it's pretty close. It's 2 hours by plane, you know, to get there. So that may be the explanation, but I'm not an expert on migration. But I think here you probably find an explanation. In the eastern part of Europe, most of the Muslims there are indigenous, are not migrants. They live there for many generations. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Tip. And we ended our discussion sharp 10:25.
Second question from
Second from
Why
student.
the number of Muslims in France and Germany? So we ended our discussion sharp, yeah, 10:25. So please give applause to Prof. Tip once again. We learned a lot from the role of state in regulating religious communities, and that can also make us reflect maybe about I took the notes, one of the notes here is that nation states are cultural projects. So I think that's an interesting notion. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for coming to this discussion. It's such an interesting discussion. And we meet again in the second session, yeah. But Daniel will going to give some announcement. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Wulan, for leading our first session. Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is coffee break. For invitees and partners, refreshments are served next to Majapahit Hall. And for honor students, refreshments are served next to Sriwijaya Hall. The next seminar session will start promptly after the coffee break at 10:45. And for your information, you may only have the coffee break only in the coffee break area. So I guess I'll see you at 10:45. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the room. We are going to continue our session with the second session of the seminar. Bu Wulan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now entering the second session. Thank you for returning to our venue. And the second session will be about the everyday life of Islam in Europe. And as the summary of the lecture has been given to me, Prof. Theo will talk about the everyday life of Islam in Europe, but not as the mundane and everyday activities, but everyday life is also having something significant for Muslims in Europe. Okay, please, the floor is yours.
There we are. Okay, welcome back. Yes. Well, what I did before the break was basically speaking about Islam. You know, governance is top-down. It's how states or institutions organize all kinds of things. And as I said before, I think it's a very important aspect of understanding, you know, how Islam takes shape in whatever situation, country or local neighborhoods or whatever. So it has to be taken into consideration. What I'm going to speak now is another thing that, in my view, is as important as this idea of governance, and that's basically, I call it everyday Islam, and maybe that's not a good term, but hopefully in the course of my lecture you will understand what I mean. Just, it's a kind of a disclaimer. I'm an anthropologist, so I'm not a theologian. I'm not. So that means that this idea of everyday is very close to my field. I'm interested as a scientist in what people do, what Muslims do. You know, how they perceive things, how they make sense of all kinds of things. That's my main interest, I would say, and therefore, of course, I'm interested in this kind of organizational governance. But this is basically my my core business in my research. So what do I mean by everyday Islam? It's a very classical theme, maybe not with this term in religious studies, not just Islam, but it's the internal controversy between social sciences. I just said I'm an anthropologist and theologians. You know, that's not very fair to say, but theologians are interested in sources, in books, in words, etc. Social scientists are interested in human beings. Again, this is not fair to make this strict distinction, but basically that's what it is about. And we can talk for hours about this. In classical religious studies, there was this term often used, if we focus on Islam, is folk Islam, is Islam of the people. But it's a very wrong distinction, not just because the idea is that, you know, folk Islam is local practices and some of them have nothing to do with Islam, etc. And then the real Islam is the Islam of the ulama, of the sources, etc. This is an old distinction you find in many Orientalist studies on Islam, Western Orientalist studies on Islam. And the real thing is the books, the so-called the Orthodox Islam, the Islam of the book. And what people do is less important, less relevant. The problem is in most contemporary studies on Islam, the use of the everyday is criticized, you know, based on this idea of folk Islam, because it ignores human agency. And again, this is, as I said in my previous lecture, the key term, the secret word in my previous lecture was the state as a cultural agent. In this lecture, it's the agency of individuals. You know, so there are sources and there are regulations, and you apply them. But in the end, there's also agency. You reflect as an individual, you reflect on things, and you take decisions. That's very important. And there are constraints. There are all kinds of conditions in which you belong. So I think that a core theme of this, my approach to everyday Islam, is this agency of individual Muslims, or in groups of Muslims. I mean, it's not just individual, but it's at least it's the, and I come to that, it's the bottom up. You know, governance is top down. This is about bottom up. Okay. Again, you can read everything if you want, but concentrate on the red. Everyday religion addresses the bottom up. I just said that. And the practices, how people do religion, how do people do Islam. And the point is, and this is very important, this is an insight from some British researchers on Christianity and on this kind of. They argue that the theologies are not made exclusively in an official venue by a religious expert, the ulama, but at the multiplicity of places and occasions, and not only by experts. So expert religion, the religion of the ulama, is a specific domain of activity and reasoning, and it should be distinguished from the not as important religious activity of non-expert, people who do not practice religion to earn their living, you know, ordinary people, like everybody. I was involved in a research I show you in a while, in which we use this word ordinary Muslims, and then many people say, what is ordinary? What do you mean by that? And it was interesting because ordinary sounds very mundane, kind of, you know, not important, ordinary. That's not, the idea is that Islam is kind of brought further, not just by the ulama, not just by the experts, but also by the so-called ordinary Muslims, people in everyday situations. They also add to that. Again, I come to that in a moment. And sometimes this everyday is also the domain where ordinary people confront order and discipline. So they question all kinds of things. And I did some research in Europe about this, you know, where people were questioning certain ideas by their religious leaders. Why is that forbidden, or why should I do that, or etc., etc. Again, I will explain that in more detail. So, agency, very important, and it's also a shift from institutions to practices. So you do not look at the institution, for example, the mosque or a madrasa or whatever, but you look at what is being done, practices. Okay? Now this is a book by some of my colleagues in Europe who wrote this book, Everyday Lived in Islam in Europe. It's an edited volume, and they have several chapters in which they address this issue, mainly from this perspective I just mentioned. This is the project I was in a couple of years ago. We got money from the the Dutch funding agency NWO, and we called that project MIWIN, Making Islam Work in the Netherlands. That's what it means. And we were especially interested in these kind of. One of the PhDs in the project is an imam. He's still working on his dissertation, and he looked at kind of informal consultation in marriage problems. Couples have a problem in their marriage, etc. Maybe they want to divorce, etc. But they don't. They want to do that according to, to Islamic rules, but they don't want the kind of official. So there's all kind of informal settings where well, this is one example. The other one was doing doing research on exercise, physical exercise, and little shops, etc., etc. But all around this question of how do Muslims make sense of that, and what are these actual practices? How does Islam work? That was the idea. Now, Linda Woodhead, one of the editors of that book, Everyday Lived Islam, she makes a distinction between what she calls strategic religion and tactical religion. Now, I'm always hesitant in these kind of dichotomies, etc. I use them also, but this is, at least they give you a kind of an idea. And she argues that strategic religion is official religion, knowledge, doctrines and laws. That is the Islam of the books and the rules. Tactical religion is everyday lived religion, and the way in which ordinary Muslims engage or confront the order and the official institutions. I already said that. So the relationship between the two is mutual. You cannot separate them and say, well, it's only tactical or only strategic. They interact, and that's the idea. So it's not a matter of what we tend to think in Europe often is, real freedom is when you do away with your religion. And that's the kind of implicit idea behind that. Whereas that's nonsense. I mean, there's much more to that. And if Muslims have agency, that doesn't mean that they always choose not to be Muslim. That's nonsense. And that's something that is often ignored in Western studies. Yeah. Talal Asad may be a name familiar to you. He is interesting. He has a Muslim origin, but his main work initially was about early Christianity and all kind of disciplining practices. In a famous article he wrote, and I think let me see. We have to also. I also have to give the title. So because this article is very hard to find. It's reprinted, etc., etc. And I have a PDF with me. So he argues that religion is in this case, Islam is a discursive tradition. And what he argues is, if a discursive tradition is something, and that's what he says, it refers to the past and to the present. It's not an Islamic tradition in the sense that it's imitative of what has been done in the past. So the idea is that all Muslims, not only the ulama, contribute to that tradition. So it's a living body, and it continues. And I find that a very interesting kind of approach, because that shows how all Muslims contribute to that. It's not just, again, not just the learned persons. And also, he says, religious tradition has authoritative status, and it operates as an ethical guideline. And so you refer to that. And he is very much against this idea. You probably know that. I don't know whether that discussion is also here in Indonesia. It's the idea of, excuse me for the term, copy-paste Islam. Ever heard that? Oh, you know that. The idea that you just simply go behind your computer and you put together your own Islam. The individualization, you know, Islam is just an individual endeavor. This is actually a kind of, I would say, it's a liberal understanding of Islam. It's a secular liberal understanding. It not only ignores that Muslims refer to these traditions, but on the other hand, it ignores also that the kind of secular liberal individual does not have any reference to ideas or sources. They are autonomous people acting completely autonomously, you know. Both is, of course, nonsense. So the idea is that that's a mutual process Linda Woodhead talks about. It's constantly, you know, it's there at the same time, very important. And he calls that, and that's a word at the bottom, the result of a historical authentication of Islamic sources. So what you do, for example, you too, as Muslims here, there are new developments. There is no kind of clear reference in sources to what to do with those new developments. And then at some point it authenticates, it's included in this discursive tradition. That's the process. Okay? What Assad actually says is, and again this must sound very familiar to you, the idea, I take my water, sorry. When I talk too long then I get, my throat is itchy, sorry. So what Assad says is, Muslims are not puppets in a fixed drama. The drama is set by the official sources, the ulama, and then Muslims are simply like puppets, you know, they follow that. He questions this idea. He says, as a discursive tradition, it connects variously with the formation of moral selves. People are, you know, the idea of moral improvement. And by doing that, you add to that. And in the recent literature, this is often referred to as Muslim subjectivity, subjectivation. It's how you as Muslim, how your being a Muslim comes about. That's the idea. Where am I? Yeah, okay. Good. Now, a colleague of mine in Berlin, in Germany, Samuel Schielke, wrote an article in 2012, and he brought in an interesting issue. You understand the complex logic of lived experiences, we will have to take the inherent ambiguity of people's life as a starting point. Now, what he means by that is, as I said before, you come across new situations. What should you do there? Sometimes you may find your own solution, and sometimes you have to seek guidance from others. But in your life there are constantly ambiguities, and I think the Muslims among you know that. Everybody knows that. But not only Muslims, also non-Muslims. I mean, the ambiguities, the dilemmas you come across in daily lives. If you then say, well, I want to live a good life, I want to be a good Muslim. How do you deal with those dilemmas? That's precisely what Schielke is addressing. And then he says the preoccupation with what Islam is. What is it that we study when we deal with Islam? A tendency to study Islam as a whole. So Schielke says we have to really focus more than we do before, or we tend to do, on you know, practices and how people make sense of things. Okay. So how can we look at this idea of the everyday? I take it a step further in relation to Islam. First, we can look at it as a set of practices. Islam practices that are intertwined with daily routines, activities. Think of the daily routine of prayer during work. You know, a friend of mine, he's an imam, and we had a seminar in some weird place in a theater somewhere. And then he said, well, I do my salat, my prayer, just in the Quran. He's a Salafi, and he's very strict on certain things. But he says, well, there's nothing wrong with that. As long as I know what the Qibla is, then nothing wrong. So this is probably a very easy example of these daily dilemmas. But there are many more to that. Endless examples. A question that immediately comes up, of course, is, and I give you a nice anecdote from my own research, is if Muslims do things, are they Islamic or not? I give you this example. I was doing years ago, I was doing research in a city, and I was in a mosque, and I was having a good conversation with one of the people there about all kinds of things in Dutch, because his Turkish was bad. And he was from Turkish descent. And then at some point they had, in the mosque, they had this internal azan, you know, then you'll hear that it's time for prayer. And he continued, and I said to him, you're not going to do your prayer? He said, no, what I do now here is more important, speak with you about all kinds of things, than the salah. So what he did, in fact, and that was interesting, I wrote an article on that, he decided for himself what was more essential for a Muslim at that moment, to follow, you know, the general rule, it's time to go to prayer, or to continue a discussion to a non-Muslim about all kinds of things. It's very interesting. What he does to me, talking with me, is that non-Islamic. I don't think we can answer that question so easily. And that's the point. Or a football club also. It was a mosque and they organized a football club, because that was a way also of, you know, bringing young people together and to create a kind of resilience against, you know, jihadis luring and trying to attract them. Is that football club not Islamic? I wouldn't say so. You see, these kind of things, interesting terrain. So, practices, that's one, and the other is a particular location. I come to that with a few examples. That is what I call space making, local space making, in neighborhoods or in all kinds of places, very important. And in my view, it's part of this concept of everyday Islam. And then a particular perspective or experience, this idea of bottom-up Islam. So what we see, if we look at this, is actually, let me see, yeah. We see two things, and that's, in my research, there's actually two foci with regard to this everyday Islam concept. One is place-making locality, I come to that, and the other one is subject, you know, moral improvement, or thinking about moral improvement. And I will address both of them, but I start with, yeah, here. This is what the slide I wanted to show. Two important fields in the study of everyday Islam. One is place-making locality, the other is ethical improvement or subjectivation. Yeah? Now, I want to start here with an interesting book. Maybe some of you have heard about it, Thomas Tweed, Crossing and Dwelling, A Theory of Religion. Some people are, and I can understand that, weary of, books that explain all religions, as if there is not religions instead of religion. But he makes some interesting observations, and one is that he says the practice of religion throughout history is boundary making, not just boundary, formal political boundaries, but also who is not, who is, and who is in, who is out, that kind of, and crossing these boundaries, fixing and flowing. These two processes you see constantly. You could argue that when this guy I just referred to says at this moment speaking with you is more Islamic or whatever you call that than going to prayer, that's a form of boundary crossing. And what I argue in an article I wrote about this is, it's probably the article let me see, I put in the, did I? No, it's another one, doesn't matter. I can send that too. He crosses boundaries, but in no way you could argue that what he does is, breaching all kinds of Islamic principles. Now, dwelling is linked up with movement, crossing boundaries, and it is three overlapping processes. It's mapping, building, inhabiting. And I briefly tell something about it. The mapping refers to orientation, location of the individual in the cosmos, but also to registration, order building. That's what I talked about in my previous lecture. Governance is also mapping. Building is a part of that. If you make neighborhoods, etc., like in the Ottoman Empire, you build. You build religious, environment. Inhabiting refers to processes how people inhabit in created life worlds and how they live by imagined geographies. That's in the article that is included, Islam, Locality and Trust. I would say everyday Islam is inhabiting. It's not one-to-one the same, but it goes in that direction. There's a beautiful example of a city in India, Chandigarh. Maybe you heard about it. It's designed by what is his name? This famous French architect, super modernity architect. I forgot about the name. It's just, he also it's super modernity, and he designed this city. And what you see, how people inhabit the city, is completely contrary to what he had in mind. Very interesting example. I forgot about the name of the architect. So, having said that, mapping, building, and inhabiting, there's a few other things that are important. Mapping and building refer to future perspectives, to these imagined orders, ideals. Again, we spoke about that. It's lecture 1, by the way, government. Also important is aesthetics, form and effect are crucial in understanding the persuasive qualities of religious homemaking. Now what I mean by that is that if you design, say, Islamic State, and I saw a lot of these, these clips on YouTube and other places in the heydays of Islamic State, how they envisioned the future caliphate. It was great. All kind of beautiful ideas. It's aesthetic. It's about how you envision that in visuals, in all kinds of forms. Thank you very much. Great. Yeah. And the third one is analytical distinction between bottom-up and top-down. Again, this is my 2 lectures. We're now speaking about bottom-up. Tweed is not very explicit about that, but I think it's very important to make that distinction. Now, if we go to this this idea of inhabiting and locality, this is about, most of all, about trust. Who is the one I spoke with in the break about halal? Here's trust. So the idea is, and this is taken from Arjun Appadurai, an American Indian anthropologist, who said locality is not just a matter of scale. It's not just the neighborhood, etc. It is about producing recognizable, reliable, trustworthy environments and subjects. If you do not trust, nothing works. And trust, in my view, and it's also in my research on authority, is crucial in understanding how people build their environments, religious or physical. So let me now this part just illustrate with a research I did for my PhD. I graduated in 1996, and I did research in the city of Rotterdam in the early 80s and early 90s. This is a case of placemaking. So what were the conditions? It was in the residential areas. The government, the municipality wanted to renew the housing. It was very old and it was bad, etc., etc. So there was a huge program of urban renewal with a desire to improve the living conditions and to get rid of the impoverished image of the city as a whole. What they needed was a firm and effective line of communication with the local population. That was very important. Now, what was the case? In poor areas in those years, the majority of inhabitants were Muslim, were migrants. So this was, well, not a coincidence, but this was the case. This is the city of Rotterdam. It's a river runs through the city, and where you see the circle, that's the area, poor area, where my research took place in the 80s and the 90s. This is what you saw. This is urban renewal in practice. This is an interesting example here. The lady who lived in this building refused to go out. So it stood there for month and month, and finally she gave up, etc. So it was really massive demolition and rebuilding, poor neighborhood. So the majority of people in this area were the guest workers. They lived in boarding houses first, and in the 1970s there were already riots. This is the boarding houses. I have visited many of these houses in the 70s. Even people sleep in a bed in shifts. So you work at night. I work during the day. You sleep in my bed during the day, and I in the night, etc. To save money. It was really horrible, I can assure you. And then in the 70s there were all kinds of riots, and it was really very bad. All the whole furniture, etc., was thrown out by rioters who were against migrants. So this was also a reason why the government, the municipalities, said, we have to renew this whole area because it's really not going well. At the same time, you saw in this neighborhood an increase of religious accommodation, small makeshift mosques, but the adherence to Islam was linked at that time still to the countries of origin. So there, that's where your loyalty was, family lines, emotions, etc., that were not specifically religious, but had to do with, you know, the condition of these early migrants. So these are as an example of the kind of buildings you saw very early on. The picture below is a mosque in a living room in a house, and the other one, this is a garage or whatever. You know, it's just, it doesn't look like a mosque, but this was the start. And they in the 1980s they were growing very fast. Here's another example of these kind of makeshift mosques in the neighborhoods. The point was, I come to that. Yeah. You know, this is also still makeshift, but it's a bit better. This was, by the way, one of the mosques I did research, Turkish mosque, Kocatepe. After a number of years they moved to that other place, you see the same name, Kocatepe. So they improved their, and that was kind of the situation you saw in the beginning. Now the point is, the municipal authorities, they wanted these spokespersons, and so they also needed spokespersons among the Muslim communities. And also they want to get rid of these mosques, these makeshift mosques. They rather wanted to have a big mosque. But one of the results was, at least there was a platform called SPIOR, I don't go into that in detail, that was a kind of a consultation platform between Muslim communities and the municipality. So many things happened at the same time. Now one of the stakes, one of the points for discussion was the municipality want these makeshift mosques out of the neighborhood, and outside the neighborhood they said, okay, we facilitate a big mosque. Well, the one on the right hand side, a Salam mosque, is the result of that. And the other one is a Turkish mosque in another area in the city of Rotterdam. They were not paid by the municipality, because, you know, we do not pay religious activities, but they were facilitated. So this was part of the deal. Now the point was, this is this organization, and the first director, this man, is a convert, a Surinamese convert to Islam. Anyway, yeah. The point was, and that's what I'm going to say, that, you know, of course, many Muslims were very glad to have this big mosque, but I saw many discussions with Muslim leaders, and they said, yes, but we also want these small places around the corner, because that's the only way in which, you know, Muslims can root in the neighborhood. And if you kind of take out all these religious activities from the neighborhood to that big mosque, what is the point? I just yesterday I heard from Dave, we went to the big mosque here. It's a big mosque, but there's also in neighborhoods are the mosques around the corner where you go to. They are equally important, and that is precisely the same there. So there was a kind of a struggle between the municipality and Muslim communities about locality, about, you know, how to become part of the local society, the neighborhood. Again, you see here a few examples. It is on the left-hand side bottom. That's a mosque, an old mosque, but partly makeshift. It's an old factory, but very active. It's in the city of Amsterdam, in all kind of things. One of the things, and this is really interesting, what you see on the right-hand bottom, is what we call, it's on the back, buurtvaders. And buurtvaders means neighborhood fathers. These are authoritative figures who, they walk around in the neighborhood and they have shifts just to make the neighborhood, there are young boys who make fuss, etc., or they vandalize. These people are extremely important, but they are trustful locals, not an official, not the police, not an official from the municipality, but local people. And this all, in a way, connects also with how Muslim communities, settle and how they take shape, right? Halal meat, another butcher. This is what I said about the general supermarkets in the Netherlands. On the left-hand side, they have said everything for Ramadan. So the supermarket knows very well how to earn money from Muslims, you know. And this is also important, building trust. This was an event taken place a few years ago when there was an attack in France. And then an imam and a rabbi, Jewish rabbi, they joined forces and they did a tour around schools about, Jews and Muslims are not at all enemies. They can work together. And the interesting thing is that they are not kind of liberal, whatever. The rabbi is an Orthodox rabbi, and the imam is a Salafi imam. And they said, what's the point? Really very interesting. And it's all about, being part of the local neighborhood. Okay. How am I doing time-wise?
9 more minutes.
There he is. So the second point, so this is about locality, trust, that kind of thing. Now this is, as I said, an important aspect in my view of everyday Islam and how it works, how it looks like. The other one is ethical improvement and subjectivation. Ethical improvement means becoming a better person in the moral sense of the word. Well, that's a very general definition, but if you apply that to Islam, to Muslims, then this is what it means. A colleague of mine from Leiden University, David Kloos, did a very interesting research, maybe you know it in English, about becoming a better Muslim. It's about Muslims in Aceh, Sumatra. Interesting. It's about this, about moral improvement. Now, I'm not dealing with this extensively, but Foucault was one of the persons, a French sociologist, died many years ago, who referred to that. He is also, Talal Assad is a Foucauldian. He wrote about techniques oriented toward the discovery and the formulation of truths concerning oneself. It's the post-structuralist concept of morality as a point of departure. So you train to be a better moral person. He also referred to that as biopolitics, disciplining, self-technology. I'm not dealing with that extensively, but these are important terms in this moral improvement field. Yes? Where are you? Yeah. Now, here again we see Saba Mahmoud. I mentioned her also in my previous, because she also, and this is a very famous book by Mahmoud, Politics of Piety, where she opens up with a discussion with Western feminists about agency, about the idea that, submitting is not a matter of giving up agency. It's a decision. And if you start from that perspective, then you understand much more what she says about the feminist or the female subject. The other book I just mentioned is an article of mine in that book, Straying from the Straight Path by Daan Bekers and David Kloos. That's the same David Kloos I just meant, and it's about failure. and it's about authentication and moral improvement. Interesting book if you're interested in this kind of material. Yeah. Now Mahmoud says in her book 2005, there's a paradoxical relation between subordination to truth and agency among the women she studied in Egypt. And again, the key term here for this whole lecture is agency. So these devotional and disciplining practices of these women, they perform that to order to attain a level of piety. So this is actual practice to become pious or more pious. Now, this is what pious is all about. What is the discussion? And that's the discussion that Mahmoud raises. It's about issues of piety and how novel forms of Islamic subjectivation are contested, negotiated, and whether or not they comply with established traditions. So here you see what I said in the beginning. If you speak about Islam as a discursive tradition, there is constant, discussion about to add, what to add, etc., etc. And these discussions deal about, resolve around issues of sincerity, issues of authenticity, what is real, and legitimacy. So what is legitimized and what is not. And so societal transformation, the growth of modern media, the growth of a well-educated, articulate generation of Muslims around the world have thrown into sharper relief the process of renewal, doctrinal renewal, and the dynamics. So this is, again, what I said in the beginning, situations of change always, they evoke these kind of discussions about how to add to that tradition I just mentioned. And it's an ongoing process. I leave this. If you have the PowerPoint, you can follow that. She explains this very nicely in this. And here we have one of my PhDs over there. She's about to. Her dissertation is about to be approved. Let's start from that. Dewi is somebody who used this idea of Saba Mahmoud extensively in her research on hijab practices, everyday life of Muslim women in this city. I want to end here. Let me see, or do I have? No. That's about it. So to end up in general, I think that if you want to understand, and that's a kind of a more social sciences, humanities perspective. If you want to understand how Islam takes shape in different settings and in evolving situations, then you need to look at these two things, because both governance, the top-down, and the everyday Islam, the kind of bottom-up, evolves constantly. It's not something that is at some point fixed and we don't have to talk about it anymore. This continuation is very important. And I think, and then I really end up, I think that both governance and this everyday Islam as a perspective opens up, allows for very interesting kind of comparison. Especially, and that's what I said in the beginning, in areas, in contexts like Indonesia, Europe, where something is happening. Yeah? That's what I had to say. I keep your image here for a while.
Okay, thank you for a very interesting discussion, Pak Til. So the everyday is political, it's not just a mundane affairs. Okay, so we have 10 minutes discussion. Yeah. So we have 2 or 3 questions. You first, and then Budia.
Dia kan juga nulis Islam juga.
Okay, thank you for the time, sir. According to my friend's perspective,
Can you speak? Can you speak in the microphone?
With the microphone. With the microphone.
According to my friend's perspective, Islam going on rise in the future in Europe. That I got in the Netherlands research, 1 million people of 6% of the total population capital in Amsterdam. By in 2030, it is predicted that will be in Europe countries that have a Muslim population above 10%, while Russia believed to be the country with large Muslim population in future. Okay, that Islam is growing rapidly there. As the problem, the higher Islamophobia in Europe. Cause this, the more people learn about Islam, okay, especially the media that always propagated in the few Islamical, like the Islam continues increase in Europe. How does Islam face challenge of the modernization and cause the Muslim population strong and continue increase? The question, what is your opinion about the future Islam in Europe? Thank you, sir.
The last question I didn't quite understand. Can you repeat that?
What is your opinion about the increase, about the rise of Muslim in Europe, like the future of Muslim in Europe, like this?
Okay.
Future of Islam.
Yeah. Take another question first, or what? Or shall I respond to this?
Okay, do you want to respond?
Yeah. Well, the number of Muslims is not increasing in Europe. That's in the mind of the people who are afraid of Muslims. You know, if you look at the figures, I mean, there's two things to say about that. One is, you know, in the minds of people who are against it, see Islam as a threat, they also use that not with Islam but with people from abroad, foreigners or whatever you call them. The point is, if you are born and raised in the Netherlands or in France or whatever, are you coming from abroad? No. So with regard to immigration, that's already nonsense. And if you add those people to increase, then you make an enormous mistake. Not you, but in general. And you mess up figures. That's one. But if you look at specifically about the number of practicing Muslims, there's another point. For example, those 1 million people in my country, in the Netherlands, only half of them are practicing Muslims. And that's precisely, we don't know in the Netherlands how many practicing Muslims there are. There is an estimation that it's 50% of these 1 million people, and the others may have, parents who, Islamic background, but they are not practicing. Are they Muslims? No, they are not Muslims. So we have to. I mean, my talk now was about practicing Muslims, and not about people who are in name Muslim. That's also another thing by which you can kind of relativize numbers. And so I would say we have to make a clear distinction between the kind of images that people have about Islam and about the future, and there's an enormous body of literature of so-called scholarly analysis about the growth of Islam. Nonsense. I mean, there is, in terms of figures, there is no evidence whatsoever. So that's very important. But I can say that 100 times, and my colleagues can say that 100 times. There is still this image. So I think, and that's very important to that's kind of a conclusion of my last lecture, is that what you see is that there's a kind of a normalizing process. Muslims are simply, citizens of this country and that country, like in any majority Muslim country, such as Indonesia or other countries. I mean, and there are people who have differences of opinion. There are all kind of movements doing things, but that's not a threat. It's in no way substantiated by evidence. I hope that's an answer to your question. Thank you.
Okay, Budia.
Thank you, Bulan. Thank you, Pak Til. It's very insightful presentation. Sorry I didn't join earlier. So I was wondering about if you can explain more the relations between European Muslim and secularizations, because as far as I understand that, I guess if I may say, all European countries are secular countries, and how do Muslims are related to the idea of a secular state, especially you mentioned about top-down and bottom-up, how Islam become part of everyday life. Because as far as I know, here in Indonesia, it's very hard for us to grasp the idea of being secular, because you mentioned about halal, right? So it's really difficult for Muslim, if they are in public, to separate between the private lives Muslim and the private choices.
The public life.
Yeah, the public. So I was wondering if there is a term, even it's called as secular Islam, which is, I think it's oxymoron, right? So I don't know, but what is your opinion about this?
Yeah.
How do they manage in terms of their everyday life, in between the secular and the religious one?
Yeah.
Are they religiously secular or secularly religious? I don't know, or in between, which I suppose there are many kind of gaps in between.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this question. I see your point. Well, on the risk of giving another lecture for 2 or 3 or maybe 4 hours, let's just briefly. The problem with the secular, in my view, is with the term secular, is that it denotes many different things. So what we tend to do in Europe is, in the English literature, is seeing secular, when somebody is religious and becomes less religious. In the Netherlands we call that deconfessionalization. So simply not practicing anymore, etc., etc. That process, which occurs in this country and anywhere in the world. And that's often referred to as secularization. Okay, that's fine, but if you take that, then the answer to your question is a different one than when you say secular is a political program. And that's what I said in my previous lecture. And that's also interesting in the book of Sama Mahmoud about the situation in Egypt. She speaks about the secular state. Egypt, in her understanding, is a secular state, but not because it is a non-religious state, but because it developed a program, to govern religious diversity. And in Egypt, it's also a vast majority is Muslim, but there is also the Egyptian government, who is rather authoritative at the moment and not very nice, also not to Muslims, especially not to Muslims. The present president is cracking down on all kind of activities of Muslims. And the idea behind that is a kind of a secular state. But then secular means governing religious diversity. And the third one is, and that's you often see in classical sociology of religion work, is what Max Weber called the Enttäuschung der World, which means is the demystification of the world. It's a kind of an idea of modernity, in which you say, well, religion should not be the principle by which state should be governed. And that's also the idea of the separation of church and state. Now, these are these different, the point, I would say, what I find the most fruitful approach is the second, where you say it's management of a certain diversity, by which you define religions, not religion, but religions, different. And then you adopt this kind of governance program. I find that the most fruitful way of using the word secular, because it helps you to understand measures that are taken and the opposition against them. I hope that's an answer to your question. But as I said, I can talk for 4 hours easily about it. It's a very important topic, so thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you, Padil, because I understand that secularism is not an easy term, especially for us here, and I guess it's pretty much contextual, you know, in the sense that where it comes from. I mean, even when we talk about Islam, you know, who's Islam, what Islam?
Exactly.
Especially when you talk about, you know, there are practicing Muslims, but at the same time,
but that's what is called deconfessionalization. But then maybe a question to you or to all of you. So what is meant here by secular? How does it appear in discussions here in Indonesia?
It's a strange term for us because, you know, it's very hard to divide. You know, making a clear-cut division between being secular or being religious, because we are mixed in between. So I guess I think your term, that's in Dutch or in English, I think might be suitable for us here.
But it's, I mean, I would also, and that's kind of an advice, I have problems with this kind of concepts that explain the world, you know? So now we have this, it's the same was with globalization. Everybody suddenly knew what globalization was. And it creates more confusion, I would say, than it solves a problem. Basically, I would say secular is, as I said, it has to do with governance, it has to do with political programs, etc., rather than with how individual, with the everyday Islam issues, you know. That's.
Yes, thank you.
Can I give a chance to one more question?
Sure. I can go on for some time.
Hello sir, my name is Muhammad Ghazali Rahman, and I want to ask you a question. You know, in Europe, especially, as football is very popular, right? And there are lots of Muslim footballers. For example, from the Champions League winner Karim Benzema from Real Madrid, and he often posts his routines on his Instagram. Do you think it will influence his fans, especially the Muslim fans, in the future, in Europe especially? I guess that's a question.
That's just a disclaimer. I'm absolutely not knowledgeable on football, so excuse me for that to start with. But you raise a very important issue, and that namely is the role of these kind of, you know, role models. In fact, I give you one interesting example in the Netherlands, where a film actor of Moroccan descent. He's a Muslim, he's a practicing Muslim, so not just by name, but a practicing Muslim. He won a very important film prize in the Netherlands for his acting. And then it's a habit to give a speech, a public speech, and he did so. Thank you very much, I'm very proud, blah, blah, blah. And then he referred to his background in a very intriguing way. I think these examples are very important in the process I also explained in my previous lecture. So the role of the young generation of Muslims. These kind of things, football, famous football players, if they refer to their background and say, well, you know, very important. So I think it's a good example, and I'm sure it works, it helps, you know.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Okay, so seems to be maybe the very last.
I say, for me, I mean, but I don't want to interfere, but I can have a couple of more questions, no problem.
Because they are students, maybe they're not very interested.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Sirajuddin. I'm come from Biomedical Engineering, Faculty of Science and Technology, Universitas Erlangga. I want to ask, so you explained earlier that the mosque provide many things for the Muslims there. Yes.
What provides many things?
Many things.
The mosque?
The mosque provide many things like iftar maybe, or social facilities for the people like this, which is good. But I have not seen any health services such as first aid kits or ambulances in the mosque. In the picture, I don't see the ambulance or something for health care services. So, do you think the mosque there provide this kind of things? What is the influence of Islam on the governance of health facilities in Europe?
I see. Well, that's an interesting question, and I think here is I don't know about the situation here, but you raise a very important issue, namely to what extent religious communities provide social welfare benefit, etc., for communities. Well, in Europe, in most countries in Europe, although it's now kind of breaking down, in the Netherlands, for example, we have the central welfare state. So, for example, hospitals, that kind of, it's provided by the state institutions. So what you see is that that what mosques do, for example, is mainly voluntary work. So these examples I gave about, you know, actions for against climate change, or helping poor people with food, etc. That's typical voluntary work. So that's should be separated from, you know, the state institutions. But there is, of course, there is interesting research about the Hezbollah in Lebanon, where the central state fails for all kinds of reasons, and groups like Hezbollah, they step into that vacuum. They provide these things. They provide, and the point is, the discussion we have, for example, in the Netherlands, but also in other countries, is that when Muslims start being active as volunteers, for example, to collect food for poor people, etc., that there's always these kind of Islamophobic politicians that, you know, there's, I don't trust them. They do that not for the benefit of poor people, but for their own organization or whatever. I think this is very vicious accusation, because I see that happening. I mean, nothing to do with you know, being ordered by movements. This is purely local. So this is the level on which you see activities of Muslims, for example, around mosques, etc. But healthcare, that kind of thing, that's typically something for the state, for the, no?
Okay, thank you. So I think that's enough. Yeah, we have already covered questions.
Was there another one? I thought there was another one, but maybe.
We have already 4 questions. I think that will be enough. Yeah. So that will end discussion.
Okay. Thank you.
It's very interesting lecture, and I'm sure that all of the audiences are very actively engaged in your lecture.